Properly understood, gun control and gun rights don't have to be culture war enemies. Rather, they can be harmonious friends and work together to strengthen each other. Often people want to put these debates in some kind of social war box, urban versus rural, Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative, and on and on. But that's not the proper way to understand any part of our Constitution. Vice President Hubert Humphrey was the embodiment of post-World War II liberalism in America, a great civil rights crusader. And in fact, probably the most important single reason why my father, who had been a Tom Dewey volunteer while in college, switched parties to become a Democrat, because Hubert Humphrey was making the Democratic Party the party of civil rights. And of course, he was certainly not some kind of conspiracy nut who hated the federal government or anything like that. He had great faith in the ability of the federal government to help solve our nation's problems. And here's what he said about the Second Amendment. The right of citizens to bear arms is just one more guarantee against arbitrary government, one more safeguard against the tyranny which now appears remote in America, but which historically has proved to be always possible. To understand where we are in the modern gun control debate in the United States, and to understand the shape of the solutions we can think about, it's important to know where we came from and how this part of how our American gun culture was created. We're now a country that has more guns than people. And we didn't get to be that way because 4 years ago, some cargo ships washed up in the country and everybody rushed out to get guns. We've been a gun culture ever since the first days of European settlement here. And the story of that is crucial to understanding the American gun culture and why we are where we are. In the colonial days, gun control was strict. The statutes of almost all colonies required gun ownership by militiamen, meaning almost all able-bodied adult males. In addition, colonies also required gun ownership by the head of a household. So, for example, a person who was 55 years old and therefore too old for militia service in most states would still be required to own a gun. And for that matter, if that 55-year-old happened to be a woman who was the head of a household, she would be required to own a gun. Massachusetts, then as now, was the strictest gun control colony at the time, requiring parents to teach their children how to shoot, and often requiring, as some other colonies did sometimes, the carrying of guns in certain situations, especially when going to large public assemblies, such as church meetings or while traveling. The right and the duty of self-defense was considered a seamless web then. There was not, in some of the legal debates over the Second Amendment in the past 30 years, there have been some people who have tried to say, well, this part that's about the militia, or it's about self-defense, or it's about this or that. What that misses is the way that the right and duty was understood at the time. It was all one seamless web. Self-defense was considered an inherent natural right. You can trace the modern formulations of this as far back as Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica, and many of the great philosophers who followed him, and then as they were interpreted and taught to the Americans by Englishmen such as John Locke. Self-defense in any particular situation was a matter of scale. You might defend your home against a burglar who was breaking in and protect your family. Or through your militia, your service in the militia, you might defend your community against a raid by the French or the Indians. Or on a larger scale, and again in militia service, you might defend your nation, your state, your broader community against tyranny, whether that was the tyranny of, as they saw it, of French absolutism, or as it developed in the American Revolution, the tyranny of King George. But these were all on a continuum. It was all the same thing. The difference between a lone criminal who was trying to rob you on the highway and a tyrannical despot who was plundering an entire nation and using a standing army to do it was simply that the second criminal had more people in his gang. It was all self-defense, broadly understood. The American Revolution began because of gun control. There had been a long-running dispute over a decade about the British power, the attempt by King George and his Whig ministers to end what had been the American system of self-government, where the colonies governed themselves internally and then let London take care of their external relations, and as part of that could certainly tax and control America's foreign trade. But King George decided that he didn't want that, and attempted to re-centralize power in London. Of course, the most famous part of this dispute was the power of taxation. Could London tax America's internal trade? But there were many other issues as well in this decade-long political dispute. But what turned this dispute into a war was gun control. In September of 1774, King George's government embargoed the shipment of all firearms and gunpowder into the American colonies. At the same time, and pursuant to instructions from London, the royal governors began sending out the redcoats to seize what were called the public arms. America, they didn't quite have gun stamps at the time, but they did have a program to provide firearms to people, to militiamen who couldn't afford their own arms and powder. And sometimes these arms and powder were stored in central armories maintained by a town or a state, and these were called the public arms. The royal governor's raids and confiscations of the public arms were accomplished by pre-dawn attacks that, fortunately for them, there was no resistance because there was nobody there. Had there been, the war would have started right then in September 1774, for example, with the powder alarm in Massachusetts and the seizure of the gunpowder stored near the present site of Tufts University. But what finally turned it into a war was when the British government began conducting house-to-house searches for guns. That's why the Redcoats marched out from Lexington, from their base in Boston, to Lexington and Concord on the morning of April 19, 1775. And this time, Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out and spread the alarm. Of course, literally meaning to arms from its French roots. And that word was spread by the ringing of church bells, by the firing of guns, and the Americans were there. They turned the British back at the Concord Bridge, and on that day, the British did search house to house in Lexington and seized some guns and gunpowder. But as they retreated, they found the Americans from all around the countryside swarming around them. They weren't even able to take the time to form into militia units. As one British soldier later noted, each man was his own commander. And they harried the British all the way back to Boston, and in fact would have wiped them out entirely had the Americans not started to run out of gunpowder. During the war, the militia were not usually able to stand up to the British regulars in an open field, regular European-style battle, unless they were also supported by the Continental Army. But everywhere, the militia denied the British the use of the country. The British, with their control of the sea, could move from one port to another much more rapidly than the Continental Army could march that same distance. But what the British had with their tactical mobility and strategic mobility by sea, the Americans had because of the militia. Wherever the British landed, there would always be resistance, because the American people were armed and would fight wherever the British came. As the historian Daniel Worston noted, later observed, the American center was everywhere and nowhere, in each man himself. And so as the British fought the war and planned what to do after they reconquered America, they planned to disarm the entire population and prohibit the possession of firearms, having correctly recognized that the American possession of arms made it impossible for a hostile foreign nation to control the country. The original public meaning of the Second Amendment reflected this. It protected the right to arms for all legitimate purposes, because it was only by protecting that right of the people to keep and bear arms that from those people there could be drawn the well-regulated militia that had proven to be necessary to the existence of a free state. In the late 19th century, the greatest constitutional scholar was Michigan Supreme Court Justice Thomas Cooley, a great civil rights activist of his time and author of the leading constitutional treatises. And as he wrote, the meaning of the provision, the Second Amendment, undoubtedly is that the people from whom the militia must be taken shall have the right to keep and bear arms, and they need no permission or regulation of law for the purpose. So the American Revolution was the first of the four great periods where gun control was a big issue in the United States. The second time was in the period before and then especially after the Civil War. Anti-slavery activists before the war tried to argue that the Constitution, which had, with James Madison's drafting, had carefully chosen to never use the word slave. It was argued by some of the most ardent abolitionists that the Constitution, in fact, prohibited slavery. One of the leading abolitionists was a great anti-slavery writer, was Lysander Spooner, and among the arguments he deployed was that the Second Amendment proves that slavery is unconstitutional. Because he said, look, the Second Amendment protects the right of all the people, without reservation, to keep and bear arms. And as he said, the right of a man to keep and bear arms is a right palpably inconsistent with the idea of being a slave. In other words, the opposite of slavery was the Second Amendment. On the other hand, in the infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney announced that free blacks were not citizens of the United States. And one of the reasons he offered for the court's conclusion was the consequences of what if they were citizens. Then he said free blacks would have the right, quote, to keep and carry arms wherever they went. Well, Lysander Spooner's humanitarian vision wasn't implemented before the war, but after the war, it was. Upon the surrender of the Confederate States, many of the states enacted black codes, as they were called, which were updated versions of the old slave codes. And they were designed to keep the former slaves in de facto slavery and submission. Mississippi's provision was typical. It was saying that no freedman shall keep or carry firearms of any kind or any ammunition. Albion Tourget, who would later serve as the attorney for Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson, and was one of the great civil rights attorneys of his time, wrote that in the areas where the Ku Klux Klan took control, almost universally, the first thing done was to disarm the Negroes and leave them defenseless. Congress was outraged. It responded first with the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which insisted that in the areas under Reconstruction, quote, the constitutional right to bear arms shall be secured to and enjoyed by all the citizens. Congress followed up with the Civil Rights Act and then with the 14th Amendment, explicitly in congressional discussion of these provisions, describing them as intended to outlaw the types of gun control laws that had been aimed at the freedmen. This period was a recognition in American history of the diversity of tyranny. Back when the Second Amendment was originally put in the Constitution, people were thinking, what about this new powerful federal government we're creating? Well, one of the guarantees that people favored was the decentralization of military force. And if you thought, well, what could go wrong? If this government somehow got out of control, what could happen? Well, then the New Hampshire militia would protect New Hampshire against federal tyranny, should that come from a centralized government. But the 14th Amendment recognized the fact that, it wasn't just this faraway government, now located in Washington, D.C., from which a danger of tyranny could come. It could also come locally, from the state governments. They could become tyrannical, as they certainly were to the freedmen. And more broadly, the tyranny is not just something that comes from government in all cases. The Ku Klux Klan, America's first domestic terrorist organization, was tyrannical. It wasn't the government, but what it did to people was a form of tyranny. And so the Civil Rights Acts and the 14th Amendment gave Congress the power to put a stop to this. And this goes back to the point understood by the colonists, that self-defense, whether it is against a robber or a kleptocracy, is still self-defense. And likewise, tyranny can come from an individual, whether that individual just happens to have power over a single victim, or it can come from a larger collection of tyrants who might have power over an entire nation. So after the 14th Amendment, the southern states, unfortunately, after Reconstruction ended, slipped back into white supremacist control. But this time they at least respected the form of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. And so gun control laws were now written in a racially neutral way. For example, Tennessee in 1870 banned the sale of all handguns except the Army and Navy model. Well, the Army and Navy models were high quality guns commonly carried by Confederate officers during the Civil War, and the white population had plenty of them. But the freedmen couldn't afford these more expensive firearms, and so Tennessee outlawed the kind of firearms that the freedmen could actually afford. Many southern states followed Tennessee's lead, with facially neutral laws banning inexpensive guns or requiring permits to own or carry a gun. As one Florida judge later explained, the laws were, quote, passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers and never intended to be applied to the white population. These racist laws of the late 19th century Jim Crow South became the foundation of gun control in America. They spread north and west in the early decades of the 20th century, being aimed mainly at immigrant populations. The Italians and Jews in New York City, or against labor agitators, as in California, or in response to blacks having defended themselves against race riots, as in Missouri and Michigan. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new civil rights movement began in the South. White supremacist tactics then were just as violent as they had been during Reconstruction. Blacks and civil rights workers armed for self-defense. Among them was Reverend Rice, the Methodist minister, and father of the future Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. And in her biography, she explains why she is a Second Amendment absolutist, because she remembered him standing guard to defend her neighborhood against bombers. And she knew that if there had been gun registration, then the racist local government would have known who had the guns and who they could be taken away from. John Salter, who was a professor at Tougaloo College and chief organizer of the NAACP's Jackson movement in the early 1960s, wrote, "No one knows what kind of massive racist retaliation would have been directed against the grassroots black people had the black community not had a healthy measure of firearms within it." Civil rights professionals and black communities in general viewed nonviolence as a useful tactic for certain situations, but not as a moral injunction to let oneself be murdered on a deserted road in the middle of the night. As the NAACP National Convention resolved, we did not deny but reaffirmed the right of individual and collective self-defense against unlawful assaults. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took the same position. He supported violence, quote, exercised in self-defense, which he called moral and legal in all societies, and he noted that not even Gandhi opposed it. Another key time of gun control in the United States began in the 1920s, when national alcohol prohibition was enacted. National alcohol prohibition was a national failure, as national drug prohibition has also been, and in both cases, prohibition has engendered tremendous amounts of criminal violence. One response to this in the 1920s was that the conservative Eastern business establishment took up the cause of handgun prohibition. The theory was, in their view, that the best way to make one kind of failed prohibition work was to have another prohibition. And this is the time when the National Rifle Association began to get involved in politics in response. The NRA had been founded in 1871 by Union Army officers concerned about the poor marksmanship of Union soldiers during the Civil War. And among its early presidents were Ulysses Grant, former president of the United States, as well as Winfield Scott Hancock, the hero of Gettysburg as he was known, and who was also the 1880 Democratic presidential nominee. And then as now, the NRA's main source of political strength was the ability to inform and mobilize its members to contact their elected officials and to participate in elections. The NRA defeated the handgun prohibition campaign in the 1920s. But then in 1934, President Roosevelt's first Attorney General, Homer Cummings, attempted to push a bill that would require the national registration of handguns and require a tax for simple possession of handguns that was well over a week's wages for a working man. This handgun restriction was part of a bill called the National Firearms Act, which would impose stringent controls on the possession of machine guns. Once Congress heard from NRA members, handguns were removed from the bill, and the machine gun restrictions went through Congress with the support of the National Rifle Association. The funny thing is, 89 years later, after the National Firearms Act, which is still the law of the land, we have this hoax issue of assault weapons, which is based on the deliberate creation of the idea that there are guns out there which you can buy at a retail store in a normal transaction that may take a day rather than the many months it takes to procure, to register a machine gun, and that these guns are machine guns or military weapons. This is false. Guns like the Colt AR-15 and the Ruger Mini-14 are not machine guns. When you press the trigger, they fire one bullet, just like every other ordinary firearm. They're not more powerful than other rifles. In fact, as rifles go, they're intermediate in power. And that's why when they are used in hunting, which they are frequently, you can look it up in Outdoor Life, which has did a special feature recently on the massive use of them in hunting. They're not powerful enough for the biggest game, such as moose or elk. They are suited for what are called varmints, coyotes and foxes. That is the technical term in hunting. Rabbits, on up to deer, but they are not capable of being used properly for hunting in the largest game. But many people think they're machine guns, and this is based on the fraud thought up by Josh Sugarman, the leader of one of the most effective anti-gun groups, who wrote a memo in 1988 that convinced the anti-gun lobby to take up this issue, and as he wrote, quote, the guns, quote, menacing looks, coupled with the public's confusion over fully automatic machine guns versus semi-automatic assault weapons, anything that looks like a machine gun is assumed to be a machine gun, can only increase the chances of public support for restrictions on these weapons. All the assault weapon bans ever written, including that currently being pushed by Senator Dianne Feinstein, don't ban guns on rate of fire, nor on the firepower, on the power of the bullet that is fired. They do two things. One is they name allegedly bad guns, which doesn't make any sense because you can just give the gun a different name. And besides that, if there's something that's dangerous about the gun, you ought to be able to say what it is without having to say the name. And then the second thing they do is ban guns based on having certain features. These features don't have anything to do with the rate of fire or with the firepower. Rather, they are on some superficial accessories on a firearm. Does a gun have a folding stock? Well, if it does, then it's easier to make it more compact and carry it in a backpack in the field when you're hunting. Does a rifle have a forward pistol grip? Well, that makes it easier to hold the gun steady, to fire it more accurately. And on the news hour, the advocate from the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence said, yeah, that's exactly why we need to ban it, because if you have a pistol grip, that prevents muzzle rise, so it makes it easier to stay on target. Well, yeah, if you're hunting or target shooting or engaged in lawful self-defense, you would want that second shot to be as close to accurate as the first shot. To say that we're going to ban guns because they have a feature that makes them more accurate, more able to be responsibly used for all the purposes the guns can be lawfully used for, seems exactly backwards. Our fourth major period of gun control is, in a large sense, the one we're living in right now. And that's the one that began in the 1960s. Violent crime was rising sharply. There were race riots in nearly every major American city, with the notable exception of Denver, where thanks to activists in Park Hill and elsewhere, we have had successful neighborhood integration and racial harmony. And of course, there were the terrible assassinations of President Kennedy in 1963, and Martin Luther King, and then Robert Kennedy in 1968. And that's what certainly got the issue going, and it's been going ever since. If you looked at the issue as of 1975, you would see absolutism on both sides. The NRA was undergoing an internal political struggle, but what came out of that after what's known as the revolt at Cincinnati in 1977, when the members at the annual meeting threw out the faction of the board that was known as the Old Guard, was absolutism. To say, of course, the Second Amendment is a right, it's an absolute right, and the typical slogan of this is, in the bumper sticker format, is, what part of shall not be infringed don't you understand? On the other hand, the anti-gun groups, which also come out of all of them today, with the exception of Michael Bloomberg's group, come out of the mid-1970s, had their own absolutism. They believed that the American people, as a general class, were unfit to possess firearms. They were too clumsy, too bigoted, too hot-tempered. They promoted gun prohibition and gun confiscation wherever they could. They succeeded in Washington, D.C., which in 1975 enacted a prohibition on the acquisition of new firearms, and also prohibited the use of any the acquisition of new handguns, and also prohibited the use of a licensed, registered gun in the home for lawful self-defense. Massachusetts came next with a gun confiscation initiative put on the ballot in 1976. The proponents called themselves People versus Handguns. Well, it turned out the people of Massachusetts thought differently. The confiscation initiative was defeated with 69% of the public opposed, many of them having been convinced by the very strong opposition of almost every police organization in Massachusetts. And again, whenever confiscation or prohibition of future acquisition was put on the ballot, it was defeated in landslides. In the California Handgun Freeze Initiative in 1982, in some three Democratic stronghold cities, in Wisconsin in 1993 and 94, and with a not quite prohibitory but quite severe set of restrictions proposed in Washington State in 1998. Whatever the absolutism of advocates on either side at various times, the US political system has delivered results which are not absolute and which seem to comport with the common sense of the vast majority of the American public. 50 years ago, most states, including Colorado, had almost no laws about gun control and almost no laws about gun rights. Today, everywhere, we have many more of both types of such laws, and properly done, those laws work effectively together. What are the principles of these laws? Well, they're reflected in the Supreme Court decisions in District of Columbia versus Heller, throwing out that ban on handguns and on self-defense, and in McDonald versus Chicago, coming 2 years later, throwing out Chicago's handgun ban and affirming that state and local governments must obey the Second Amendment, just as they must obey almost all of the rest of the Bill of Rights, such as the First Amendment. So one principle is that, as the Supreme Court has ruled, the right to keep and bear arms is indeed a fundamental individual right, just like the First Amendment rights or most of the rest of the Bill of Rights. So what does that prohibit? It prohibits laws which are designed to discourage the exercise of the right. Licensing laws which are made to be deliberately cumbersome and to discourage people from even trying to become a legal gun owner. It means you cannot ban a large class of ordinary firearms, handguns in the DC and Chicago cases, but the general principle is articulated in these cases is that what is protected by the Second Amendment is firearms which are typically used by law-abiding citizens for legitimate purposes. This is sometimes called the common use test, or as I tell my students at DU Law School, normal guns for normal people. And that has some direct implications for today's debate. When we look at normal guns for normal people, as the Supreme Court instructs in Heller, to say that found the reason that handguns can't be banned is because they are the firearm, which as Heller wrote, are overwhelmingly chosen by Americans for these law-abiding purposes, especially of self-defense. Well, when we talk about banning magazines, what are the ones that are commonly owned by law-abiding Americans for self-defense? Semi-automatics constitute 81% of new handgun sales. Most of the rest are revolvers. If you go into a gun store today and say, I want to buy a handgun, and the clerk says, well, what kind? You say, I don't know, I want a typical handgun. Well, he'll offer you a semi-automatic, because that's more typical these days than a revolver, and when you resolutely refuse to say anything else except to say typical, 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 he will sell you what his customers typically buy, which is a semi-automatic handgun with a magazine, factory standard, not high capacity, a standard magazine between 11 and 19 rounds. That's what Americans typically, commonly buy today for the handguns they choose for lawful purposes of self-protection and others. And when you go see a police officer with his handgun in his belt holster, it is very, very likely to be one of those as well. The reason the police officers choose them is the same reason that law-abiding citizens do, because they are, in their view, the best for self-defense, for lawful defense of self and others. And likewise, if you buy a rifle, and again you just go in and say typical, the store will sell you what has been, for at least the last 5 years, the best-selling rifle in the United States, which is the AR-15 type rifle with a standard magazine of 30 rounds. If you go and look in a police car around this country, and you see what kind of long gun is in that car as a backup firearm for the police, you'll find a variety. Some of them have shotguns, but you will find a vast number of AR-15 type rifles with a 30-round magazine. The police aren't carrying an AR-15 because they're going hunting, or because they're gun collectors, or because they want to murder a lot of innocent people. They are carrying that AR-15 in their trunk and their 13-round magazine with their semi-automatic handgun on their belt for only one reason, which is the lawful defense of self and others. And the same reasons that make these guns are so commonly chosen by the police for lawful self-defense is why these guns are typically chosen by law-abiding citizens for legitimate purposes and plainly protected by the Supreme Court's decisions in Heller and McDonald. I won't tell you about 50-round magazines, 100-round magazines, whatever they are. They're certainly not as clearly, obviously, within the Heller and McDonald common use test. I'm not sure what good banning them does, given that magazines can be changed in about a second or two with practice, although that's more difficult if one is under criminal attack by several people, which is why someone would want a 14-round magazine in a handgun or a larger magazine in a rifle in the first place. But another part of the consensus that Heller and McDonald reflect of the American people is that the Second Amendment is not absolute in every instance. Now, it is no more absolute than the rest of the Constitution. So if you look at the First Amendment, can Congress or a state legislature outlaw a particular religion? Absolutely not. That part of the First Amendment is indeed absolute. There is no amount of social science evidence or broad public support or anything else which could ever permit a government to outlaw a religion. At the same time, not every sincere religious practice is absolutely immune from government regulation, or in some cases, even prohibition. One may sincerely believe in human sacrifice, but it can still be banned, even though that does infringe one's exercise of religion. Likewise, reasonable gun controls are permissible if they are not intended to discourage or limit the exercise of the right, and they have a strong connection to what in the 19th century would be called perfecting the exercise of the right, to keeping guns out of the wrong hands. The National Instant Criminal Background Check, used whenever you buy a gun in a gun store, is one example of this. We have a similar situation in Colorado. We actually started several years before the national check went into effect. This Colorado system is broken and it needs to be fixed because it was called the instant check. When you buy a gun in a store, and I'm not talking about a high demand period like with this current political controversy going on, I'm talking about normal times. Anytime you go into a store in the past few years, the wait for the instant check in Colorado is typically hours long. There has to be the funding allocated for this to make it instant. And this is especially true if we're going to be thinking about enticing private persons, not regulated people in the business selling to customers, but just two individuals who are friends selling to each other. If you want to have those sales, which are about under 10% of gun transfers, not the 40% that Michael Bloomberg falsely claims, but if you want to get that 10% of transfers into the background check system, you're going to have to entice two neighbors who can just as easily transfer the gun between each other and nobody will ever know the difference. You want to get them to go to the store and have a background check run on the transferee. Well, make that genuinely instant. If they have to wait around 6 hours, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen if they have to wait around 75 minutes. Make the Colorado instant check system actually instant. Another example of how non-absolutism can be consistent with reasonable gun control is Colorado's system of licensed carry. Colorado, like 40 other states, protects the right of law-abiding citizens to bear firearms for lawful protection. The statute was written by the county sheriffs of Colorado. It is not an absolute right. It doesn't say anybody can carry anytime, anywhere. Rather, it says when you go out of your home or place of business, when you go into public, it's reasonable to have different rules about what goes on in public than what goes on your own property. In public, you can get a permit to carry a handgun, a concealed handgun for lawful protection, if you go through a 10-point fingerprint check that takes several weeks because it's sent to not only the CBI but the FBI. You have to pass a safety training class. And in addition, and this was a provision that was very important to the sheriffs and they insisted on it, even if your background check comes out okay and you pass the class, the sheriff still has the discretion to deny the permit if the sheriff has evidence that the applicant would be a danger to himself or others. Now, there's an appeals process and for denial in that case, and the sheriff has the burden of proof in that. But that's an example of something that provides for the fair and orderly exercise of the right, not designed to perfect it, to make sure that people can carry firearms for protection and that they're ready for the responsibility of doing so. So can we improve our firearms laws? I think so. There's lots of ways we could talk about improving our laws to better protect gun rights and improve gun control in a proper way so that it reinforces and supports gun rights rather than being an opponent of it. Our guiding principle should be the principle that has made this country so much safer over the last 30 years. In 1982, our homicide rate was over 10 per 100,000 population in the United States. Today, it has fallen to less than half that, to about the mid-4s. We've cut the homicide rate in half. We've cut the violent crime rate dramatically. This country now is as safe from violent crime as it was in the early 1960s, before that terrible surge, decades-long surge began. There are lots of reasons for this social improved, wonderful, and hopefully continuing to improve social situation. One of those is that this country, through the political process, rather than relying on absolutes, has followed a system which supports more guns in the hands of people who should have them and fewer guns in the hands of people who should not. Thank you. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Shoot.
Go ahead. I got one question.
Yeah.
I have to preface it.
Yeah.
First of all, I've lived in the UK for 30 years.
Yeah.
And secondly, I'm an academic. So the figures I have on the US deaths is 82,163 gun-related deaths in the years 2011, which is, and this includes gun injuries, not only homicide, right? So it's 10.5 per 100,000, right? The ones I have for the UK is there were 155 deaths in the same year, right, which was 0.025 per 100,000. Why aren't we talking about this evidence?
I will give your phone number to Piers Morgan's booker, and you can get on the show probably tomorrow night.
That question.
Yeah. The vast majority of gun deaths in the United States are suicides. Whether even gun prohibition would affect the suicide rate much is something that scholars argue about, but they agree that it is at most a marginal effect. So yes, in the UK, where the government has deliberately created conditions of gun scarcity, what we fought the revolution to avoid, people commit suicide by other means than guns. To the gun prohibitionists, that's some great figure to tout. To me, it seems to miss the point that we ought to be thinking about mental health. And that fortunately, this country's finally having a good conversation on that. And that certainly includes suicide prevention by any means. Secondly, the gun scarcity conditions in the UK are one of the reasons why the UK has a violent crime problem much worse than the United States. A woman in the UK is 3 times more likely to be raped than one in the United States. When you put the four major categories of violent crime by FBI definition together, homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, the UK rate is far above the US rate. The United Nations, which is not generally considered one of the top pro-gun organizations out there, has said that Scotland is the most violent country in the industrialized world. In the UK, in England, especially in England and Wales, the burglary rate is much higher than in the United States. But throughout the UK, the percentage of burglaries that involve home invasions is 4.5 times the US level. If your home gets burglarized in the United States, 13% of the time, that will be when you're home. The studies, the other 87%, the burglar worked hard and successfully to make sure you weren't home, to break when you weren't there. That's in fact from the burglar's working day, that is by far the most time-consuming part of the job. Why do they put this extra time into it in the United States? The studies of the burglars themselves say we avoid occupied homes in the United States because the risk of getting shot is so high. Half the households in this country own guns, and if you don't put up a sign on your front porch saying, "Proud to not own a gun," the burglar doesn't know. And therefore the burglar has to, as a matter of his own safety, avoid the occupied homes. In England, where gun ownership is rare and is, for all practical purposes, prohibited for self-defense by laws that required the gun and the ammunition to be stored in a separate safe so that they're impossible to retrieve in a sudden emergency. We have a 13% home invasion burglary rate. Their rate of home invasion burglaries is 59%. Because from the burglar's point of view, all the better when somebody's home, because then you have purses and wallets and you can get the cash, which is, you don't have to sell at any discount to a fence. You get the full value of what you did as a burglar that day, rather than having to take some stereo component and sell it for 80% off its actual value to a fence. So has Britain's policy of gun scarcity for law-abiding citizens reduced the rate of gun homicides in England? I would say yes. But it has also resulted in terrible collateral consequences. And overall, that is why we are a much more crime-free country than the UK. Yes? Go ahead. Yeah. Yes?
You said that the background checks are taking 6 hours or more. Is that because of the state, the delay is in the state doing that? My question is, I just recently volunteered to teach Sunday school at my church and have to have a background check. I understand why they do that. But we had to pay for the background check. I think that people who buy guns should also have to pay for that background check. And it would probably be a quicker way to do it.
The opposition to that is based on when they teach, and of course if you taught public, if you were becoming a school teacher in a public or private school, same thing, and you get paid for that.
Well, and this is a volunteer church.
Right. The concern is on those checks, nobody worries. The church volunteers say, well, so what did you pay? How much was it?
$30.
$30. Nobody is worried that there's nobody in the legislature who says there's too many church volunteers out there, and so now that we made the background check mandatory and it's $30, let's raise it to $50 this year and $100 the next year and after that, to try to discourage church volunteering or becoming a school teacher. We have seen in other states the problem, in Massachusetts for example, that once you have these fees put into place on gun owners, for which is in terms of the number of gun sales compared to the number of church volunteers or people getting their becoming a school teacher for their first time, the volume of that is so high that there is a temptation for some people to raise the fee just to discourage the activity, and also to try to run it as a cash cow, so that instead of funding just the background check system, it's used to fund something else. For example,
but I do think they could pay for their own background checks. If they can afford to buy a gun, they could pay for a background check.
Well, I think if you're talking about me, the answer is yes. If I'm buying a $450 gun, can I pay $30 for a background check? That is not true for everybody along the line. The person who's buying a used handgun for $85 because that's all she can afford. That $30 could make a big difference to her. And then I think the other thing to take, and I'm not saying you're completely wrong, I think your idea has some point to it, but another thing we want to think about is if we were trying to have the private sales, just the neighbor selling to the neighbor, to have, if we're, something that is by its nature unenforceable. The only way this is going to happen is voluntary compliance. If we're going to skim $30 off of that transaction by making them pay for it, we'll have less. My preference would be to pay for it with general tax revenues so that we encourage more people to come in. For me, the $30 gain of them, the two private sellers paying for it, is less than the benefit of having a system that encourages them to come in and do it voluntarily, which is all they ever will do in practice.
But general tax revenues are so low that it's difficult to get all that money together.
Well, our overall state and local tax burden, Colorado is more of a local centric than some other states. Overall, our total state and local tax burden is about medium by national standards. Yes?
2 points, please. The lady talked about the UK. In countries like Switzerland, every male is in the army, and every male has what is wrongfully called an assault rifle, and they have some of the lowest crime rates in the world, so if you'd like to comment on that. But the second point, and maybe more important on so-called gun legislation, is my 2 brothers, myself, my 13 nephews and nieces, the majority are gun owners. 2 of the nephews are NRA instructors. And I can assure you they can pass any legislation they want, and most of us are not going to surrender our guns. So I ask you to comment on that. What do you think would happen if there was a ban, figuring there's 300 million guns legally in America? What would the result be?
Well, the last time mass gun confiscation was tried in this country was started on April 19, 1775, and it didn't work out in favor of the people who did the confiscation. And more broadly, it's something, when we're talking about confiscation, which is an issue on the table. The New York Times just ran an op-ed by an Australian elected official touting the mass confiscation that took place in Australia in the 1990s, and then another mass confiscation early in this century. The Australians lined up at the police station and turned their guns in, for some compensation, although not sufficient. It is unrealistic to expect that would happen in the United States. I actually wrote a book, my first book was a comparative study of international gun control. It was published in 1992 and was named Book of the Year by the American Society of Criminology, Division of International Criminology. It's called The Samurai, the Mountie, and the Cowboy: Should America Adopt the Gun Controls of Other Democracies? And it talks about Switzerland, which is the country in the world with the highest, probably per capita, possession of machine guns. Because there, as you said, if you are a Swiss militiaman, basically aged 18 to 45, I think, you have your government-issued real assault rifle. Not only does it look like a machine gun, it is a machine gun. And you have to have that at home. You have to certify your practice with it and shoot at a continually proficient level with that. In addition, gun ownership in Switzerland of other firearms is quite widespread. And after you're done with your militia service, you can keep your actual assault rifle, but it has to be down converted. So instead of being a machine gun, which fires bullets, you just keep your finger pressed on the trigger and bullets come out continuously, you can keep it as a non-militia man after your retirement by having it converted to semi-automatic so that it fires only 1 bullet at a time. And as you say, Switzerland has a very low level of crime in general and of gun crime, and their militia system is part of that. But one of the things I say in the book is, great for them, but that doesn't mean it would work in the United States. Even in the United States, back in the olden days when, was it easy to get people to come to militia practice in 1774 when the threat was imminent? Definitely yes. But it was not easy to get them to do that consistently in 1821 when there was no external threat. and people just wanted to do what they wanted to do, and even if they came, they might not be as serious as they should. And a lot of these militia musters where you show up to prove you have your militia suitable weapon, okay, everybody shows up with their gun in the morning, and then they spend the rest of the afternoon getting drunk and firing off guns at target practice, and jolly community fun and all that, but not fully a well-regulated militia as they have in Switzerland. America's gun culture is much more a culture of individualism, of every man his own center. And so the more communitarian Swiss version of militia service, which works very well in Switzerland and helps build a really responsible gun culture, isn't something we could readily transplant to the United States, certainly not on the mass scale that exists in Switzerland. The figures provided by, there was a few years ago, this very common factoid that 90% of Mexican crime guns came from the United States. That was never an accurate figure. It was something that was just propounded in Mexico and picked up in the United States for political purposes, where bashing the United States has its own domestic political advantages. And it's important on the figures, where in the United States do they come from? The predominant source of criminal guns in Mexico that come from the United States is guns that are lawfully sold under government-to-government transfers to the Mexican military and transfers to Mexican law enforcement. And from there, through theft and through the massive corruption of Mexican army and Mexican law enforcement, a great deal of those arms end up in the hands of the narco-traficantes. And we're not just talking about guns. There's a lot of much heavier equipment that also comes legally sold out of the United States to the Mexican government, and the Mexican government is in part a subsidiary of the Mexican organized crime, and so the transfers happen that way. Studies of Charles Grassley, the senator, did a study based on traces conducted by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in Mexico of guns seized there. Roughly 28% of their guns were guns that had some origin in the US domestic market. Of those 28%, the vast majority were older guns. If you have a new gun, the gun was produced this year, it's produced in 2011, and you see it at a Mexican crime scene in 2012, that's the kind of gun that might have come from a store and then bought by a Mexican trafficker and brought down to Mexico. If you have a gun with an average age of 12 years, and that is the average age of American domestic market guns found in Mexico, that is an indication that it is a stolen gun. And so, are guns stolen in this country? Absolutely. Probably several 100,000 stolen guns in this country annually, maybe more. They go into a black market that is more than sufficient to supply American criminals, at least those who can use the black market, with the guns they want. And also, that black market networks with the Mexican black market and smugglers and brings those guns south. So it is not, despite what Mexican politicians and some American politicians say, a problem that is primarily about guns being lawfully sold today in retail stores in Texas or Arizona or elsewhere, with one important exception, and that is a criminal operation known as Fast and Furious. The guy who did that, in my view, is a sociopath. He was the special agent in charge of the Phoenix office of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. He ran this operation where you convince law-abiding gun dealers who are regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. It's their license. I mean, they're quite heavily under the thumbs of this bureau for their continued professional existence. He set up this operation to tell law-abiding gun stores, sell these guns to people you wouldn't. A straw purchaser is someone who is an elite, who can pass a background check because he doesn't have a criminal record, but he's buying on behalf of someone who is a criminal. The National Shooting Sports Foundation, the trade association of the firearms industry, has long run a educational program to inform the American public, don't do straw purchases, they're illegal, it's a serious felony, and to train gun store employees in how to detect straw purchases. Under this Phoenix Run operation, stores were told, you're going to have obvious straw purchasers coming in. Go ahead and sell to them anyway, and then we'll get the information on what kind of guns they're buying, and don't worry, we'll follow these guys when they leave the store. We'll make sure these guns never get into criminal hands. That second part was a lie. They didn't follow it, and when they had 8 field agents who tried to, they were pulled off and told not to. 500 guns went into criminal hands in a program this guy ran in the latter part of the Bush administration. When the executives at the BATFE in Washington, D.C. found out about it, they started asking questions, and he shut the program down immediately in Phoenix, rather petulantly, but that ended round 1. Then in the fall of 2009, it starts up again. This time it goes on for well over a year. Over 2,000 guns. This time it's strongly supported by high-ranking officials at BATFE, at the U.S. Department of Justice, all the way up to one step away from Eric Holder, who apparently was see no evil, hear no evil, and has no idea what was going on. It was a flagrant violation of, among other things, United States laws against international arms trafficking. You cannot export guns from the United States without State Department approval. And unlike some gun control laws internally, there is no law enforcement exception. You can't do it and say it's part of a sting operation, which this wasn't. There was no follow-up on it except to count the dead bodies and the recoveries of guns in Mexico, where it's, according to the Attorney General there, led to over 300 Mexican homicides. Even if it had been a legitimate law enforcement operation, you can't do it without written authorization from the U.S. Department of State. No one has ever suggested that the Hillary Clinton State Department provided that authorization. And so we have 2,500 guns put deliberately into the hands of the Sinaloa cartel especially, causing homicides in Mexico. And what has happened to anybody for that? A few people have resigned from their jobs. Some others got transfers. This, if an administration is genuinely serious about preventing criminal gun violence, ought to be leading right now to felony prosecution of those people who were conscious accessories to the murder of Mexican people. Yes.
Is there any kind of gun that you feel should not be available to the ordinary American citizen?
I would say that, in my taking my samurai book as the starting point, which is you have the gun laws that fit the culture of the country. So, for example, in New Zealand, they're very into their sporting rifles and shotguns, but handguns are not particularly important to them. They have some, but it's not that big a deal. Or in Japan, where their culture of gun prohibition actually works quite well because it reinforces, not complete prohibition, but nearly. It reinforces their very top-down, authoritarian, communal, group-centric approach to society, and it's fine. It's one of the reasons they have a low crime rate. I'd say in the United States is to recognize the consensus we got to, whereas machine guns got their strict controls in 1934 under the National Firearms Act. Since 1986, the manufacture of new machine guns for the American market, for the non-government market, has been prohibited. So there are probably about 100,000, semi-antique by now, machine guns lawfully possessed in this country, and that's as large as it'll ever grow unless the 1986 law changes. And I guess my view is that seems to fit with what the American people want. As a gun policy matter, I don't know on that. I haven't really studied it, but it fits where the American consensus is, and so I wouldn't favor disturbing that consensus. But certainly for the kind of firearms that are now commonly available, you go to Cabela's and look at the guns they have available for sale there. No, I don't favor prohibiting any of those. Those are all in the category of the normal guns for normal people that are commonly possessed in this country by law-abiding persons.
One last question.
Yes.
My perspective is I'm a Quaker, a non-gun owner, lifelong a physician, a medical epidemiologist, and so I look critically at the causal relationship between gun laws and reduced murder rates or gun violence, and I don't honestly see any. So I think to this point they have failed as a effective societal preventive. What I do see in all the mass murders recently is that almost all of them were caused by young men who would in other times be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And if we are unable to effectively screen and treat and manage paranoid schizophrenia with antisocial violent ideation, we'll probably continue to have these type of problems, except they may be with bombs if there aren't guns. So.
I think you make a good point, and certainly some of those perpetrators, like the Aurora murderer, actually do have the intelligence and skills to build bombs. As you know, the onset age for schizophrenia is so typically young males, older teens, early 20s. With 300 million guns out there, it's difficult to imagine depriving them of guns, certainly if they have especially if they have a plan over weeks or months to perpetrate the crime. The Aurora murderer, the Newtown murderer are certainly people who, under what the laws were 50 years ago, could have been readily civilly committed. And quite clearly we know they should have been. Those laws were changed in part because of legitimate concerns about due process and fairness. They were sometimes abused, so if there's a 17-year-old girl and she's rebellious and promiscuous and skipping school and all that, well, the solution to that isn't to put her in a mental institution, but that was sometimes done. I think we can, with careful respect for due process, and what the Supreme Court has said is the standard has to be clear and convincing evidence, which is below what you need for a criminal conviction, but above the standard burden of proof in cases. We ought to have a system where, when there is clear and convincing evidence, that we have the resources and the ability that those people can be civilly committed for their own protection and for social protection. I think that's the most important long-term reform we can make. And that, by the way, does require significant additional government spending. This isn't cheap, but it's well worth it in terms of what it can prevent.
I think the governor has made that first step in Colorado and didn't just to be credited for not immediately jumping on just a repeat of the same old anti-gun laws, but thinking about the source problem.
Yeah. And in the long run, it actually pays for itself. It's expensive up front, but your reduced criminal justice costs and your reduced victimization costs would make this pay for itself over the course of the years. Well, thank you.
Thank you.